The phone buzzed at 2:47 a.m., cutting through the quiet hum of the medical equipment in the Buckhead mansion. Denise Washington had been a night nurse for 12 years, but her hand still trembled as she saw the caller ID, Westminster Academy. No school calls parents in the middle of the night unless something is very wrong. Her 12-year-old son, Marcus, was supposed to be sleeping safely in their small apartment in Decatur, his inhaler on the nightstand, his breathing steady and calm. Mrs. Washington, this is the emergency contact system. Marcus is in the nurse's office with a fever of 103 and severe nausea. He's asking for you. The automated message felt cold and clinical, but behind those words was her son, scared and sick, 15 miles away from where she sat monitoring, an 82-year-old man with advanced Alzheimer's who couldn't be left alone. Denise closed her eyes and felt the weight of an impossible choice. Leave her post and lose the job that provided Marcus's health insurance, the same insurance that kept his asthma medication affordable at $89 a month instead of $890. Stay and leave her child alone and frightened in a place that smelled like disinfectant and fear. What she didn't know was that Cameron Mitchell, the 19-year-old heir to the Mitchell fortune, was watching her through the security monitor from his study down the hall. He had inherited control of the family estate and its staff when his parents died in a car accident 8 months earlier, and he had been taught to think of employees as replaceable resources. But something about the way Denise's shoulders sagged as she stared at that phone made him pause the financial reports he was reviewing. Cameron had fired 6 nurses in the past year. Some had made medication errors with his grandfather. Others had shown up late or left early without permission. One had fallen asleep during her shift and been caught by the morning security check. Each termination had been swift, professional, and final. The Mitchell family had built their wealth in real estate and private equity by maintaining strict standards and clear boundaries. Employees who couldn't meet expectations were replaced immediately, but Denise had never missed a day in 8 months. She had reorganized his grandfather's medications into a color-coded system that reduced confusion. She had installed soft lighting in the bathroom to prevent falls during nighttime wandering. Most importantly, she had somehow managed to reduce Harold Mitchell's violent episodes from 4 or 5 times a week to maybe once or twice. The old man actually smiled when she entered the room, something Cameron hadn't seen him do since before the dementia took hold of his mind. Now she was sitting in the rocking chair beside Harold's bed, holding her phone like it might explode, her face reflecting the blue glow of the medical monitors. Cameron could see her lips moving in what looked like a prayer, or maybe just the mental arithmetic of an impossible situation. Rent, groceries, co-pays, and the promise she had made to Marcus when his father left 3 years ago, that she would always be there when he needed her. The house felt different at 3 a.m. During the day, it bustled with landscapers, housekeepers, and the steady rotation of deliveries that kept a 12,000-square-foot home running smoothly. But in these quiet hours, it was just Denise, Harold, and Cameron, connected by the invisible threads of dependency and responsibility. Harold's breathing was steady, aided by the humidifier that Denise had requested and the evening medication routine she had perfected through months of careful observation. Cameron made a decision that would have shocked his business school professors and horrified the family attorneys who managed the estate's operational protocols. He walked down the Persian rugged hallway to Harold's room and knocked softly on the doorframe. Denise looked up, startled, probably expecting to be fired for taking a personal call during work hours. "Ma'am," Cameron said, his voice still carrying the formal distance he had been taught to maintain with staff. "I couldn't help but notice you received some kind of emergency call." Denise straightened in her chair, her professional mask sliding back into place despite the crisis. "I apologize, Mr. Mitchell. It won't happen again. That's not what I'm asking about." Cameron stepped into the room, noticing how she had arranged Harold's favorite photographs on the nightstand and placed a small speaker that played soft jazz throughout the night. "Is everything all right with your family?" The question caught her off guard. In 8 months of employment, no member of the Mitchell family had ever asked her about her personal life. She had been hired through an agency, completed her background check and medical certification, and begun work with nothing more than a brief orientation from the outgoing nurse. Her job was to keep Harold safe, comfortable, and medicated. Nothing in her contract mentioned anything about her own family or her own struggles. "My son is sick at school," she said finally. "He has asthma, and when he gets fever, it can turn into something more serious pretty quickly. But I understand my responsibilities here, and I won't abandon my post." Cameron looked at his grandfather, sleeping peacefully in the hospital-style bed they had installed when his mobility became limited. Harold was wearing the soft pajamas Denise had recommended, instead of the stiff dress shirts he had insisted on for months. His breathing was even, his face relaxed in a way that had become possible only since Denise learned to play Miles Davis's Kind of Blue at low volume during his evening routine. "How long would you need to be with him?" Cameron asked. "I don't know. Maybe until morning, maybe longer if we have to go to Scottish Rite, but I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm telling you." Cameron pulled out his phone. "Robert drives for us sometimes. He's probably awake anyway, likes those overnight radio shows. He can take you to your son and bring you both back here if needed. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one." Denise stared at him as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate the offer, but I can't leave Harold alone, and I certainly can't bring my sick child to your home. You're not leaving him alone. I'll stay with him." "With respect, sir, you don't know his routines, his medication schedule, what to do if he gets agitated or confused." Cameron realized she was right. Despite living in the same house, he knew almost nothing about the daily reality of caring for someone with dementia. He had signed the checks for medical equipment and approved the hiring of professional staff, but he had never spent more than 10 minutes in his grandfather's presence since the disease progressed beyond casual conversation. "Then teach me," he said, "right now, whatever I need to know to keep him safe until you get back." For the first time since her phone rang, Denise allowed herself to consider the possibility that she might be able to save both her job and her son. She looked at Cameron Mitchell, this young man who had inherited more wealth than most people could imagine, who had been raised in boardrooms and private schools, who probably had never changed a diaper or wiped a fevered forehead or sat in a hospital waiting room counting the minutes until visiting hours began. "It's not that simple," she said. "If he wakes up and doesn't recognize you, he might become scared or aggressive. People with Alzheimer's need consistency, familiar faces, familiar voices. But he might not wake up at all, right? It's only a few hours." Denise hesitated. Harold usually slept straight through from his evening medications until about 6 in the morning. His sleep patterns had become more regular under her care, partly due to the structured routine she had established, and partly due to the adjustment his neurologist had made to his medication timing based on her detailed notes. "If he does wake up," she said slowly, "you'll need to speak calmly and clearly. Don't try to reason with him if he's confused. Don't argue about what year it is or whether his wife is still alive. Just redirect his attention to something comfortable, the music usually. Sometimes he remembers song lyrics, even when he can't remember names." Cameron nodded, pulling out his phone to call Robert. While he made arrangements for the car, Denise quickly wrote out Harold's medication schedule and emergency contact numbers on a sheet of paper. Her handwriting was neat and precise, the letters formed by someone who had filled out countless medical charts and incident reports over the years. "His next medication isn't until 6 a.m., she explained. "The blue pills in the weekly organizer. If he seems confused or agitated, you can play the jazz playlist on the speaker. Sometimes he responds to stories about the old days, but don't expect him to remember them consistently. And if he falls or seems to be having trouble breathing, call 911 first, then call me." Robert knocked on the front door 20 minutes later. A quiet man in his 60s who had been driving for wealthy Atlanta families for decades. He had seen enough domestic emergencies to ask no questions and offer no commentary. He simply nodded when Cameron explained the situation and helped Denise gather her purse and the light jacket she kept on the back of Harold's door. "I'll have my phone on," she said as she prepared to leave. "If anything happens, anything at all, please call me. I can be back here in 30 minutes. Cameron watched the tail lights of the Lincoln Town car disappear down Peachtree Street, then turned back to face a responsibility he had never imagined taking on. Harold's room smelled like the lavender lotion Denise used for his evening routine and the faint medicinal scent of the equipment that monitored his vital signs. The jazz was still playing softly, and the old man's breathing remained steady and peaceful. Cameron settled into the rocking chair where Denise had spent countless nights and realized he was holding his breath. He had managed multi-million-dollar investment portfolios and overseen the renovation of 3 commercial properties, but the prospect of caring for one confused elderly man felt more daunting than any business challenge he had ever faced. At 4:15 a.m., Harold stirred. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then searching the room with the confusion that comes from waking in an unfamiliar world. Cameron felt his heart rate spike as the old man's gaze landed on him, trying to process the presence of someone who was both familiar and strange. "Where?" Harold began, his voice rough with sleep and medication. "You're at home, Grandpa," Cameron said, keeping his voice low and calm, the way Denise had instructed. "You're safe. Denise will be back soon." "Denise," Harold repeated the name like he was tasting it, trying to connect it to the matrix of memories that still functioned in his damaged brain. "She makes the music." "That's right. The music is still playing." Harold listened for a moment to the soft trumpet melody, and Cameron watched his grandfather's face relax slightly. This was a version of Miles Davis that Cameron had never paid attention to before, but apparently it held some significance in the landscape of Harold's remaining memories. "Are you the boy who brings the coffee?" Harold asked. Cameron wasn't sure how to answer that. He had brought his grandfather coffee a few times during family gatherings years ago, back when Harold could still navigate conversations and recognize faces consistently. "I can get you some coffee if you'd like." "The morning coffee is too strong. Denise makes it right. She'll be back to make your coffee," Cameron promised. "Do you need anything right now? Water? Are you comfortable?" Harold seemed to consider this question carefully, as if comfort was a concept that required deep thought. "The pillows are good," he said finally. She fixed the pillows. Cameron looked at the arrangement of pillows, supporting Harold's back and sides, positioned to prevent pressure sores and provide support for his increasingly frail frame. He had never noticed the careful engineering of his grandfather's comfort, the way every element of the room had been adjusted and refined to meet the needs of someone whose world was shrinking toward the boundaries of this bed and this chair, and the few faces that still registered as safe and familiar. They sat together in the semi-darkness, 2 generations of Mitchell men who barely knew each other anymore, connected by DNA and real estate holdings and the absence of the woman who had somehow learned to build bridges across the gap that dementia had carved between Harold and the rest of the world. Cameron's phone buzzed with a text from Denise. "At the hospital. Marcus is stable, but needs to stay for observation. We'll call when I have more information." He showed Harold the phone, though he wasn't sure whether his grandfather could still read or process text messages. "Denise is helping someone who's sick. She'll be back as soon as she can. She's a good nurse," Harold said, "better than the others." This was the longest coherent conversation Cameron had shared with his grandfather in over a year. Harold's moments of clarity had become increasingly rare and brief, usually occurring in the early morning hours when his medications were at optimal levels and his brain was rested from sleep. Cameron realized that Denise must have noticed this pattern and adjusted her routines accordingly, timing conversations and care activities for the windows when Harold was most likely to be present and responsive. "What made the other nurses not as good?" Cameron asked, genuinely curious. Harold frowned, working to access memories that might have been recorded yesterday or 3 years ago. They talked too much, explained too much. Denise just does things. Cameron understood what his grandfather meant. He had watched the previous nurses try to reason with Harold when he became confused, attempting to reorient him to current reality through logic and repetition. Denise never argued with his misconceptions. If he thought it was 1987, she would ask him about 1987. If he was looking for his deceased wife, she would help him look without explaining that Margaret had died 5 years ago. At 5:30 a.m., Harold's breathing changed slightly, becoming more shallow and rapid. Cameron felt panic rise in his chest, but then remembered Denise's notes about morning restlessness. She had written that Harold sometimes experienced anxiety as his sleep medications wore off, and that gentle music and quiet conversation usually helped him transition to waking consciousness. Cameron turned up the volume on the jazz slightly and began talking about the garden outside the window, describing the way the dogwood trees were starting to show their spring buds. He found himself telling Harold about the cardinal that had been visiting the bird feeder and about how the fountain in the front courtyard needed cleaning. Simple, present-moment observations that required no memory or complex processing. Harold's breathing settled back into a regular rhythm, and he even smiled when Cameron mentioned the cardinal. "Margaret liked the red birds," he said. "She did. She used to keep birdseed in the kitchen, in the blue can, by the window." Cameron had no memory of his grandmother keeping birdseed anywhere, but he nodded as if this detail was perfectly accurate and important. He was beginning to understand that the truth of Harold's statements mattered less than the feeling they evoked, the sense of connection to something that still felt real and meaningful in the confusion of his altered mind. At 6 a.m., Cameron carefully followed Denise's instructions for the morning medication, checking the blue pills in the weekly organizer and offering Harold water in the special cup with the large handle that was easier for shaking hands to grip. Harold took his pills without complaint, a routine that had apparently been established through months of patient repetition. Cameron's phone rang at 6:45. Denise's voice was tired but relieved. "Marcus is responding to the nebulizer treatment. They want to keep him until this afternoon to make sure his breathing stays stable, but he's going to be fine. Take as long as you need," Cameron said. Harold had a good night. "We've been talking about birds." Birds. He remembered that Margaret used to keep birdseed in a blue can. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's the first time I've heard him mention her name in months," Denise said quietly. "You must have caught him during his best time of day." Cameron looked at Harold, who was now dozing peacefully as the morning light began to filter through the curtains that Denise had chosen, because they allowed natural light while preventing glare. His grandfather's face looked younger somehow, the worry lines smoothed by whatever dreams were playing behind his closed eyes. "What time do you usually start his morning routine?" Cameron asked. 7:30. Breakfast first, then his shower. I have it written out step by step if you want to try." Cameron did want to try. For reasons he couldn't fully articulate, he wanted to continue this strange night that had taught him more about his grandfather than the previous 2 years combined. "Walk me through it." Harold's breakfast was not the elaborate meal that Cameron might have expected for someone from a wealthy family. Instead, it was carefully calibrated for someone with swallowing difficulties and digestive issues. Oatmeal with banana and a touch of honey, scrambled eggs cooked until they were very soft, orange juice diluted with water to reduce acidity. Each element had been chosen and refined based on Harold's responses and preferences, a process of trial and error that spoke to months of careful attention. Cameron found himself paying attention to details he had never noticed. The way Harold's hands shook slightly when he held the spoon, requiring the special utensils with weighted handles that Denise had ordered. The way his grandfather ate slowly and deliberately, sometimes pausing mid-bite as if trying to remember what came next in the sequence of chewing and swallowing. The way he smiled when Cameron told him the eggs were good, even though Cameron had followed Denise's instructions exactly and could take no credit for their preparation. The shower routine was more complex, requiring assistance with balance and temperature monitoring and careful attention to Harold's skin, which had become fragile with age and medication side effects. Cameron had to call Denise twice for guidance on details that she probably managed without conscious thought. How warm should the water be? Which soap was gentlest for sensitive skin? How to help Harold step into the shower chair without making him feel helpless or embarrassed. "You're doing fine," Denise assured him during the second call. "The first time is always the hardest. He trusts you, or he wouldn't be cooperating." By 9 a.m., Harold was clean, dressed, and settled in his favorite chair by the window, where he could watch the bird feeder and the activity on Peachtree Street. Cameron realized that this window positioning was not accidental. Denise had arranged Harold's day around small pleasures and gentle stimulations, birds, familiar music, the changing light throughout the day, the routine of meals and medication that provided structure in a world where memory could no longer be trusted. Cameron called his office and cancelled his morning meetings. He called the family attorney and postponed a contract review that had seemed urgent 12 hours earlier. He sat with Harold and discovered that his grandfather had opinions about the Falcons' draft picks and memories of trips to Savannah that might have happened in 1978 or 1998, or some combination of both decades blended together in his mind. When Denise returned that afternoon with Marcus in tow, she found Cameron and Harold looking through a photo album of family vacations. Harold was pointing to pictures and telling stories that were partly true and partly confabulated, but entirely engaging to someone who had learned to listen for the emotional truth beneath the factual confusion. Marcus was pale but breathing easily, clutching an inhaler and wearing a hospital bracelet that would need to be cut off in a few days. He was clearly nervous about being in the big house, staying close to his mother's side and speaking in the careful, quiet voice that sick children use when they're trying to be good. "Mr. Mitchell," Denise said, "I can't thank you enough. And I'm so sorry about Marcus being here. I know it's not appropriate, but the doctor said he shouldn't be alone today, and I couldn't find anyone else to—" "Stop!" Cameron held up a hand. "First, Marcus is welcome here as long as he needs to be. Second, I should be thanking you. I learned more about taking care of Harold in one night than I'd learned in 2 years." Harold looked up from the photo album and noticed Marcus for the first time. "Who's the boy?" "This is Marcus," Denise said. "He's my son. He looks sick. He's getting better. He just needs to rest today." Harold considered this information with the serious expression he wore when processing new social situations. "Does he like birds?" Marcus nodded shyly. "There's a red one that comes to the feeder. Margaret used to like the red ones." And just like that, Cameron watched his grandfather include a 12-year-old boy in the small circle of people who still mattered in his shrinking world. Marcus approached the window carefully and stood beside Harold's chair, both of them watching for the cardinal that might or might not appear on this particular afternoon. Cameron pulled Denise aside while Harold and Marcus bonded over bird-watching. "I want to change how we handle family emergencies," he said. "What happened last night shouldn't have been a crisis. You should never have to choose between your job and your child." Denise looked uncomfortable with the conversation. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate what you did, but I don't expect special treatment. I can manage my personal life without affecting my work. That's exactly the problem. You shouldn't have to manage it alone." Cameron had been thinking about this all morning, between medication doses and breakfast preparation. What if we had a formal policy, family emergency coverage, backup care arrangements, whatever it takes so that good people don't have to make impossible choices? The other nurses won't like that. What other nurses? You're the only one who's lasted more than 3 months. You're the only one who's actually helped Harold get better instead of just preventing him from getting worse. This was true, and they both knew it. Under Denise's care, Harold had fewer episodes of confusion and agitation. He slept better, ate more consistently, and had even regained some mobility with the gentle physical therapy exercises she incorporated into his daily routine. His neurologist had commented on the improvement in his latest evaluation, noting that Harold's decline had slowed significantly and that his quality of life appeared to be better than expected for someone at his stage of dementia. "I'd need to talk to the family attorneys," Cameron continued, "but I don't see why we can't formalize this. Emergency childcare coverage, backup nursing staff, whatever it takes." Denise was quiet for a long moment, watching Harold teach Marcus how to identify different birds by their coloring and size. "The other staff would need the same consideration," she said finally. "Rosa's daughter is starting high school next year. James's father just moved to assisted living. If you make this policy, it has to be fair for everyone." Cameron nodded. This conversation was moving into territory he had never explored as an employer, but it felt more important than any business decision he had made since inheriting control of the family assets. "Then we make it fair for everyone." Over the following week, Cameron found himself spending more time in Harold's wing of the house. Not because Denise needed assistance, but because he had discovered that his grandfather was more interesting and complex than he had realized. Harold's memories might be unreliable, but his observations about people were often surprisingly sharp. He noticed when Marcus was having trouble breathing before anyone else did. He remembered that Denise liked her coffee with cream but no sugar. He asked thoughtful questions about Cameron's work that revealed he was still processing and understanding more than his family had assumed. Cameron also began to understand the skill and dedication required for quality elder care. Denise wasn't just administering medications and monitoring safety. She was constantly assessing Harold's mood, energy level, and cognitive capacity, adjusting his activities and environment to maximize his comfort and engagement. She had developed strategies for managing his behavioral challenges that were based on months of careful observation and experimentation. When Harold became agitated during thunderstorms, Denise would play specific pieces of classical music and engage him in simple hand exercises that seemed to calm his nervous system. When he had trouble sleeping, she would read him short stories from a collection of Flannery O'Connor that had belonged to his wife, using Margaret's voice patterns and cadence that she had learned from old family videos. When he became frustrated with his physical limitations, she would guide him through modified versions of exercises he had enjoyed as a younger man, adapted for his current abilities, but maintaining the sense of accomplishment he needed. The family attorneys were initially resistant to Cameron's proposal for a formal emergency family leave policy. "It sets a precedent," they warned. "Other employees might take advantage. It could become expensive." "How expensive?" Cameron asked. "More expensive than constantly hiring and training new staff. More expensive than having Harold regress because we can't keep consistent caregivers." He had done the math. The cost of the emergency coverage policy would be less than what the family had spent on hiring agencies and replacing staff over the previous 2 years. More importantly, it would ensure that Harold received consistent, quality care from people who understood his specific needs and preferences. The breakthrough came during a family dinner 3 weeks after the night of Marcus's emergency. Cameron had invited his Uncle David and Aunt Patricia, who managed other aspects of the family's business interests, to discuss the proposed policy changes. They had been skeptical about Cameron's increased involvement in operational decisions, preferring the previous arrangement where professional managers handled day-to-day issues while family members focused on high-level strategy. Harold joined them for dinner, which had become more frequent since Denise established his evening routine around family interaction rather than isolation. He was having one of his better days, able to follow conversations and contribute appropriately to discussions about current events and family news. "Cameron's been helping with my morning routine," Harold announced during dessert. "He makes terrible eggs, but he's learning." Uncle David looked surprised. "You've been doing hands-on care? A few times a week. It's educational." "Educational how?" Cameron chose his words carefully. "I understand now why Denise has been so effective when other nurses haven't. It's not just medical training. It's consistency, attention to detail, and genuine caring. Those aren't qualities you can easily replace." Aunt Patricia seemed intrigued. "And you think this family leave policy will help maintain that consistency?" "I think it will help us retain the staff who have proven they can provide quality care. Denise almost quit 3 weeks ago because she couldn't balance her job responsibilities with her son's medical emergency. We would have lost her, and Harold would have suffered." Harold looked up from his peach cobbler. "Denise is the good one. The others talk too much." Uncle David laughed. "Well, Harold's endorsement carries a lot of weight with me. The policy was approved unanimously. Tell me in the comments what you would have done differently here. I actually read them. Implementation began immediately. Rosa, who cleaned the house and managed laundry, was able to attend her daughter's high school graduation without using vacation days. James, who maintained the grounds and handled security, received assistance with his father's transition to assisted living without having to choose between his paycheck and his family obligations. The emergency fund covered temporary replacement staff and additional resources as needed. But the real test came 6 weeks later when Marcus had another asthma attack, this one more severe than the first. Denise called Cameron at 11 p.m. from the emergency room at Scottish Rite, her voice tight with the controlled panic that parents learn to manage during medical crises. "They're saying he might need to stay several days this time. His oxygen levels aren't stabilizing the way they should. I know I just used the emergency policy last month, but—" "Stop!" Cameron interrupted. "Of course you need to be with him. How can I help? Could Robert maybe bring me some clothes and my phone charger? I didn't have time to pack anything when the ambulance came." "Robert's already on his way. What else?" "Harold's evening medications are in the kitchen, in the organizer marked Monday through Sunday. His bedtime is usually 10:30, but if he gets agitated, the music playlist on the bedroom speaker helps him settle down." Cameron was already walking toward Harold's wing of the house. "I remember the routine. Is there anything different I should know?" "He's been asking about Margaret more often lately. Dr. Rahman says it might be related to the seasonal changes, something about how light affects his circadian rhythms. If he gets confused about where she is, don't try to correct him. Just redirect to something concrete, like what he had for dinner or what birds he saw today." Cameron found Harold in his pajamas, sitting on the edge of his bed with a confused expression. "Where's Denise? She always helps me with the buttons." "She's helping Marcus, who got sick. I'm here to help with the buttons." Harold studied Cameron's face, working to process this information through the fog of his damaged memory. "Marcus is the boy who likes birds." "That's right. Is he very sick?" Cameron helped Harold with the difficult buttons on his pajama shirt, marveling at how such a simple task could become challenging when fine motor control was compromised by age and medication. "He's sick enough that he needs his mother with him, but the doctors are taking good care of him. When I was sick, Margaret stayed with me. She was a good wife." "She was." Harold settled back against his pillows, looking satisfied with this assessment. "Denise is like Margaret. She stays." Cameron adjusted the pillows the way Denise had taught him, supporting Harold's back and ensuring his breathing wasn't restricted. He started the evening music playlist and dimmed the lights to the level that had proven optimal for sleep preparation. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" Harold asked. "Of course." Cameron spent the night in the rocking chair, monitoring Harold's breathing and responding to the occasional moments of confusion that occurred when sleep medications began to wear off. He found himself thinking about the transformation that had occurred over the past 2 months, not just in Harold's care, but in his own understanding of what it meant to be responsible for someone else's well-being. When he inherited the family business, Cameron had focused on financial metrics and operational efficiency. He had measured success in terms of profit margins and return on investment. But caring for Harold required different measures: hours of peaceful sleep, moments of genuine connection, the absence of pain and fear. These outcomes couldn't be quantified in the same way, but they were no less important and no less worthy of careful attention and resource allocation. Denise called the next morning with better news. Marcus's breathing had stabilized overnight, and while he would need to stay in the hospital for another day or two, the crisis appeared to be resolving. She would be able to return to work by the end of the week. "How did Harold do?" she asked. "Better than I expected. We talked about Margaret, and he slept through the night. He ate most of his breakfast and remembered that Marcus likes birds." "You're getting good at this." Cameron looked at Harold, who was currently engaged in his morning routine of watching the bird feeder while listening to jazz. His grandfather had become a different person under Denise's care, more present and engaged than Cameron had thought possible for someone with advanced dementia. But the improvement wasn't just due to medical expertise. It was the result of someone taking the time to understand Harold as an individual, to learn his preferences and fears, to create an environment where his remaining abilities could flourish instead of just preventing further decline. "I've been thinking," Cameron said. "When you come back, I'd like to continue helping with Harold's care, not because you need assistance, but because I want to be more involved." "Are you sure? It's not easy work, and it's not always rewarding in the ways people expect." "I'm sure. And I've been thinking about expanding the program." "What program?" Cameron had been developing this idea for weeks, discussing it with the family attorneys, and researching similar initiatives at other family foundations. "A training program for family caregivers, people who are caring for relatives with dementia but don't have professional backgrounds. We could offer classes, support groups, maybe even some financial assistance for home modifications and equipment." Denise was quiet for a moment. "That's a big undertaking. We have the resources, and I've learned that good care makes a bigger difference than I realized. If we can help other families provide better care, if we can support people like you, who have the skills and dedication to do this work well, it seems like a worthwhile investment." "Where would you hold these classes?" "I was thinking we could use the conference room in the East Wing. It's large enough for groups, and it's close to Harold's room, so people could see examples of adaptive equipment and room modifications. We could bring in specialists from Emory and the CDC, maybe some of the therapists who work with Harold." The idea was ambitious, but it felt like a natural extension of what Cameron had learned about the importance of quality caregiving. If the emergency family leave policy had taught him anything, it was that supporting the people who provide care ultimately benefits everyone involved: the caregivers, the care recipients, and the families who depend on them. When Denise returned to work 3 days later, she found Harold in better condition than she had expected. His medication schedule had been maintained precisely, his room was clean and organized, and he greeted her with genuine pleasure at seeing a familiar face. More surprisingly, she found detailed notes that Cameron had written about Harold's sleep patterns, appetite, and mood changes over the 3 days she had been absent. "You've been keeping professional-level documentation," she observed. "I figured it might be useful for Dr. Rahman's next evaluation, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing any changes that might be significant." Denise read through the notes, impressed by their thoroughness and accuracy. Cameron had recorded not just basic information about medications and meals, but also Harold's responses to different activities, his moments of clarity and confusion, and the strategies that had worked best for managing his care. "These are really good notes," she said. "You've got a natural instinct for this kind of observation. I had a good teacher." Over the following weeks, Cameron continued his involvement in Harold's daily care while also developing the family caregiver support program. He interviewed other families who were dealing with dementia, learning about their challenges and the resources they needed most. He met with social workers and geriatricians to understand the broader landscape of elder care and the gaps that existed in current service systems. The program launched 6 months later with a small pilot group of 15 families from the Atlanta area. Classes were held twice a week in the Mitchell family's East Wing conference room, covering topics like medication management, home safety modifications, behavioral strategies for dementia-related challenges, and self-care for caregivers. Harold became an unofficial mascot for the program, often joining classes to demonstrate techniques or simply to provide encouragement to family members who were struggling with similar challenges. His presence reminded participants that people with dementia could still experience joy, connection, and dignity when their care was approached with skill and compassion. The most powerful moment came during the 3rd month of the program, when a woman named Sandra brought her husband George to meet Harold. George had early-stage Alzheimer's and was resistant to accepting help or acknowledging his diagnosis. He had been angry and frustrated for months, lashing out at Sandra and withdrawing from activities he had previously enjoyed. Harold and George sat by the bird feeder window, watching for the cardinal that had become a regular visitor. Harold began talking about the different birds he had learned to identify, sharing information that might have been accurate or completely invented, but was delivered with such enthusiasm that George became engaged despite himself. "The red one comes in the morning," Harold said. "Margaret used to say they brought good luck." "My wife likes birds too," George replied. "She keeps trying to get me to help her fill the feeder, but I forget." "Forgetting isn't the same as not caring," Harold said, with the kind of wisdom that sometimes emerges from the simplification of dementia. "The birds come back anyway." Sandra later told Cameron that this conversation was the first time George had admitted to anyone that he was having memory problems. It became the turning point in his acceptance of his diagnosis and his willingness to work with Sandra to adapt their daily routines to accommodate his changing abilities. A quick like tells the algorithm this kind of story is worth amplifying. The program grew over its first year, serving over 60 families and establishing partnerships with local hospitals, senior centers, and community organizations. Cameron found himself becoming an advocate for policy changes at the state level, testifying before legislative committees about the need for better support systems for family caregivers and increased funding for dementia research and services. But the most meaningful changes occurred within the Mitchell family itself. Harold's condition continued to progress, as was inevitable with Alzheimer's disease, but his decline was slower and gentler than anyone had expected. He maintained his connection to familiar people and activities longer than his doctors had predicted, and he experienced fewer of the behavioral difficulties that often accompany advanced dementia. More importantly, Harold's final years were characterized by dignity, comfort, and genuine human connection. He continued to enjoy music, to look forward to visits from Marcus and other children in the caregiver support program, and to recognize and respond to the people who had become central to his daily life. Cameron's relationship with his grandfather deepened in ways that would have been impossible if he had maintained the emotional distance that his upbringing had taught him to preserve. He learned that caregiving was not a burden to be outsourced, but an opportunity for connection that enriched both the giver and receiver. When Harold died peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, surrounded by family and the caregiving team that had become like family, Cameron realized that the emergency phone call that had started this transformation had been one of the most important moments of his life. It had taught him that true wealth was measured not in dollars or assets, but in the quality of relationships and the care people provided for each other. At Harold's funeral, dozens of families from the caregiver support program attended, along with Rosa, James, Robert, and other staff members who had benefited from the policy changes Cameron had implemented. Marcus, now 14 and managing his asthma successfully, served as an honorary pallbearer. Denise spoke about Harold's kindness and his ability to find joy even in the midst of confusion and loss. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from Sandra and George, who had continued their participation in the support program even as George's condition progressed. "Harold taught us that love doesn't require perfect memory," Sandra said. "It just requires showing up again and again for the people who matter." The Mitchell Family Caregiver Support Program continued to grow, eventually expanding to serve families throughout the Southeast and becoming a model for similar initiatives across the country. Cameron established an endowment to ensure its permanent funding, but more importantly, he had learned lessons about leadership, compassion, and human dignity that informed every aspect of his personal and professional life. The emergency family leave policy became standard practice not just for the Mitchell household, but for all of the family's business operations. Other wealthy families began adopting similar policies, recognizing that supporting employees' family responsibilities was not just ethically right, but practically smart, resulting in lower turnover, higher quality work, and deeper loyalty. Years later, when Cameron was asked to speak at conferences about innovative approaches to elder care and family-friendly employment policies, he would always begin with the same story: a phone call at 2:47 a.m., a choice between job and child, and a young man who learned that sometimes the most important business decision is the one that puts human dignity above operational efficiency. Marcus went on to study medicine, inspired by his childhood exposure to quality healthcare and his mother's example of professional dedication combined with personal compassion. He specialized in pulmonary medicine, focusing on pediatric asthma, and often credited his early experiences in the Mitchell household with teaching him that healing requires not just medical expertise, but also attention to the social and economic factors that affect families' ability to access and maintain care. Denise eventually earned her nurse practitioner degree through a program that Cameron helped fund, allowing her to expand her expertise while continuing to work with families affected by dementia. She became the clinical director of the Mitchell Family Caregiver Support Program, training other nurses and developing protocols that balanced professional standards with the flexibility and compassion that family-centered care requires. The ripple effects of that single night of crisis management extended far beyond what anyone could have predicted, touching hundreds of families and changing the way an entire community approached the challenges of aging, caregiving, and employment policies that recognize the full humanity of workers and their families. If this gave you hope today, subscribe. We're building a small corner of the internet for that. The cardinal still visits the bird feeder outside Harold's former room, now converted to a resource library for the caregiver support program. Visitors often comment on the bright red flash of color against the green of the carefully maintained garden, and long-time program participants know to tell newcomers about Harold's belief that red birds bring good luck. Whether or not that's scientifically accurate, the families who have found support, hope, and practical assistance through the program that emerged from one night's emergency phone call would probably agree that sometimes luck looks a lot like people who are willing to stay awake all night, learn new skills, and change old systems in order to make sure that no one has to choose between caring for their job and caring for their family. In a world that often seems to value efficiency over compassion and profit over people, the Mitchell Family Caregiver Support Program stands as evidence that wealth can be measured in many ways, and that the most valuable investments are often those that cannot be quantified on a balance sheet, but can be felt in the improved quality of countless lives, the dignity preserved in difficult circumstances, and the knowledge that when crisis calls at 2:47 a.m., there are people and systems ready to respond with both competence and care.